if you can do something else other than comics, if you're not already actively producing pages and writing scripts every day because it's just all you can do, you know, I kind of fall on the side of being a bummer, and I say fuck off, because don't waste your time. It's a rough industry, and if you don't eat it and live it and sleep it and fuck it, then it'll fuck you. That would be my sage advice.
I remember being a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, upstart comic book YouTuber. About 6 years ago, I was listening to a lot of interviews, and that particular statement from Rick Remender has always stood with me. At the time, I thought, my goodness, that man seems very cynical. But over time, I have come to realize that that man was pretty much spot on when it comes to working in comic books, even at Marvel and DC Comics. They just don't pay a whole lot of money, and there's a whole lot of crap that comes along with it. And I was reminded of this by an article on thepopverse.com from Joseph Illidge. If you remember, I think it might have been like 6 weeks ago, he had an article talking about how he was going to like kind of open people's eyes to the comic book industry. And there was really nothing in the article itself. I was like, okay, hope the next one's better than this. And I didn't even realize he had the follow-up. And admittedly, I do look at the Popverse a couple of times a week at least. I never even saw it promoted, but he actually had something. It breaks down what it's like to be a comic book creator. And he paints an even bleaker picture than what Rick Remender had to say in that interview about a decade ago. A very bleak picture indeed. It almost goes on to talk about how like comic books are basically killing people. And really, if you look at some of the evidence, he might be more correct than you or I would like to believe. He kind of breaks down what the pay is for comic book writers, artists, colorists, letters, and all that kind of stuff, and what the economic infrastructure is for comic books and what it takes to actually be successful and even earn like a living wage. And this is what Mr. Illidge had to say. It's common knowledge that the top publishers don't always pay the top rates. And in fact, paying low and earning high is one sure way to maintain a certain profit level month to month, quarter to quarter, year to year. One source of competitive rates isn't even within the top 10 direct market publishers. It's with crowdfunded projects. Oh yes, people with the dream of becoming an independent comic book publisher and the financial resources to make it happen, likely through a 9-to-5 job, want their books to be top quality, able to compete at every artistic level with Marvel and DC Comics. They will pay creators between median and high rates to get that quality. But of course, those kinds of projects are generally few and far between, so they don't make for a stable financial lifestyle in and about themselves. Talking about the financial ecosystem as a comic book creator, that in some cases, you might have a better chance to make better page rates working for someone that's never even made a comic book, that just wants to self-publish their own thing in crowdfunding, and you can compete with Marvel and DC. And this kind of reminded me the story of Brian Ball and his artist Luigi. Back in the day, once Rags was starting to get some momentum, people were kind of talking about it, and he had a very different model. He was doing like a Patreon model, I believe he still is, to get his comic books out to people and get them funded. And Marvel were interested in his artist, Luigi, who also lives here, I believe, in the Philippines. And he was able to compete with Marvel Comics. He was able to go out there and meet or beat Marvel Comics' offer to Luigi and keep him on board to do Rags instead of going on to work on Marvel Comics projects. At the time, it seemed inconceivable, but over time, you realize just how little Marvel Comics or DC Comics really even pay their creators, and you kind of understand why. But it's absolutely insane to think that you or I, if we were funded correctly, could go out there and beat the price of Marvel and DC. And you wonder why so many artists are happy to go out there and work for Mark Miller. He's not really even like a full-time comic book guy anymore. He's like a Netflix producer, but he also obviously loves comic books. He wants to bring his ideas to market in comic books first, and he's able to bring in basically all the best artists in the entire industry, and there's nothing that DC and Marvel can do about it. And it's probably because they don't want to do anything about it. They don't want to actually compete and pay these artists specifically what they're worth. And that's why a lot of them have moved on to video games. A lot of them are doing their own, self-publishing projects. A lot of them would rather go work for Image Comics, for Boom Studios, do crowdfunding, do video games, do animation work, anything other than comic books, because they're just not being paid enough. And we wonder why there's no marquee names left. There's not even any writers left. Why toil down at DC and Marvel Comics with the hope that, hey, if I write a great Batman story, it might end up in a movie. It might end up in a cartoon series or something like that. But even if it does, you're not even going to get paid then. They don't even pay you out when you create something that makes them $1 billion. And that's why we're kind of in the state we are, where there just aren't a lot of top flight, really good creative people in what should be the best jobs in the industry, period. because they're just not worth it. Illidge then goes on to paint a picture of how many hours creators are working these days just to make ends meet and the kind of toll it takes on you. That's anywhere from 60 hours to 105 hours per week, which means you're going from working 50% more hours than the average 9-to-5ers to approaching burnout level. But burnout is inconvenient. You don't have time to get sick and take a few days off to recover. Can you escape the death spiral of diminishing health, the diminishing time you'll have at the apex of your success, and diminishing awareness in a changing landscape of editorial staff shifts and publishing in which a superhero dog, kids with diaries, and manga are eating your client's lunch in sales? Now, this is a pretty interesting point he makes here, because as a full-time YouTuber, it started out as a hobby, but I guess I am a full-time YouTuber now. I work about, I would say, 65 hours a week. On average, it's about 65 hours a week. I actually don't take any days off unless I'm on vacation, whatever. That's just kind of the schedule that I like. It's the schedule I maintain. But I have certainly felt burnout from time to time, and I've taken 2 days off once. I actually took 4 days off at one time. But I can do that. If I have burnout, I can do whatever I want because there's nobody dictating my hours and how much work I have to do. But, if you're in comic books, you have to meet deadlines, and meet those deadlines, you're going to be working a lot. And if you want to make enough money just to get by as a writer, you can't write one comic book a month unless you're a superstar. You're probably going to have to write 4 or 5 comic books in a month to really make a lot of money, unless you're making the bulk of your income outside of comic books itself, which I've certainly heard from a lot of people that that's what they do. And that's why you see so many people that are all in on comic books, and they seem really depressed. They seem burnt out, and most of them appear to be struggling mightily, at least in the financial sense of things. And there is a toll to pay, especially when it comes to your health. Maybe not so much if you're a writer so much. There's a lot of different things that you could do as a writer to kind of make things a little bit more manageable. But as an artist, I remember talking to Ron Garney here on the channel. He's a great guy, had a fantastic conversation, but he was running down just all the things that have happened to his body, just as far as like his neck and his shoulder and his wrist and his elbows and stuff, because he's been sitting down at a table 8 to 10 hours a day, for his entire adult life in one position doing the same thing. And it has taken a lot out of him. And from what I can ascertain, Ron Garney has certainly been well compensated for that. But there is a price to pay when it comes to your health. Tim Lim, a good friend of mine, friend of the channel here, he became a full-time comic book artist later in life. And I remember him talking about some of the issues that he was having just because he was illustrating so much. It was taking so much out of him, like physically, just to stay on top of the schedule that he and Mark Pellegrini had set for Common America and their other projects that they were doing. So the health cost is very real. Can you actually quantify, is it taking years off of people's life? I imagine in certain instances that it actually is. But to be fair, that's probably true like in most professions. But it's not quite like when you look at the ECW wrestling roster from like 1995 and you see where those guys are now and how many of them aren't alive anymore and what age they died. It's not like that. It's not like an epidemic of premature death going on, but there's certainly an enormous price to pay. And Joseph Illidge paints a pretty interesting picture here. And I would certainly, if you want to get into comic books, I would check out this entire article if you can go out there and find it. Like I said, they didn't really promote it, but the dude does have a ton of experience. I believe he started out as an assistant editor at Milestone Comics and then, kind of worked his way up the ranks over the years, over the decades, really, bouncing around between a lot of different publishers until, of course, he was the editor-in-chief over at Heavy Metal Magazine. So he started at the bottom and worked his way all the way to the top, and he talks about negotiating these contracts and how much he was working these people. And it sounded like it kind of took a toll on him as well. This is the last thing I'll talk about that he mentions in the article that I thought was interesting. Think about our fallen heroes, friends, mentors, and peers in the industry. Gone too early, their legacies reprinted and remixed for profit, and the highest levels of posthumous public respect, like the never-ending selection of new musical tracks from dead hip-hop artists. Maybe you can navigate your career in the middle of the road, but with the comic book industry's increasing product volume and demands from on high that trickle down to the creators, a greater likelihood is that you'll burn out unless you choose to execute up. Kind of speaking to the long-term prospects of being a lifelong comic book pro, eventually you're probably going to have to leave comic books behind and move on to something that's just a little bit more sustainable for your day-to-day life, for your mental and physical health and all that. And there certainly have been a lot of GoFundMes. There's been a lot of stories about really significant creators that have found themselves in a bad spot later on in life once they left comic books behind, because Sure, they made some money when they were younger, but it was never enough money. It wasn't enough money to really get lifelong savings. It really wasn't enough money to ensure that they had health insurance into their later life and all that kind of stuff. You know, we see what's happening with Peter David right now. He had multiple strokes while he was working at Marvel Comics. He's been in the hospital and he's had a few extra issues since then. And he had to do a GoFundMe. He had to go out there and ask for support from the fans of his work and say, hey, listen, I'm in a spot right now. My family is potentially going to be in financial ruin unless we can get some help on this because the bills are piling up and the health emergency hasn't quite gone away yet. And I imagine he's going to be paying that stuff off for quite some time. And Peter David isn't a nobody. Peter David did significant work not only for Marvel, but for DC Comics. And a lot of his work has really impacted, it's influenced the way people think about the characters to this day. Especially when you think about like Young Justice and Hulk and a lot of the other characters that he's worked on. He's done such great stuff. And even Peter David is in a tough spot. You know, Bill Messner-Loebs, some of the greatest Wonder Woman stories of all time. When you talk about the most important comic book heroes in the history of North American comic books, you know, Wonder Woman is up there. That's in the top 5 or 6. And he's had several instances where he needed help. I think he was basically homeless at one point with his wife. And those stories are very, very sad. You never want to see people that you admire and you look up to end up in a spot where they can't even really take care of themselves. But the one thing you have to remember, the comic book industry is not going to take care of you. They're always looking out for their own bottom line. You might write the greatest Batman story of all time, but it'll never be your story. It'll be DC Comics story, and they'll never give you the credit that you deserve. And you'll certainly never get the financial windfall that you deserve for creating something that might generate well over $1 billion when you think about adaptations to movies, animation, toy sales, shirt sales, just comic book sales themselves. Think about all the stories that DC Comics are selling today in graphic novel format. The graphic novels they're selling today were almost all created 30 years ago, 20 years ago by the best writers in the industry. And people are still paying for these comic books 20 and 30 years later, yet these guys aren't millionaires. It's absolutely insane the way that the comic book industry kind of chews you up and spits you out. Like I said, I started out, I thought, Rick Remender, that guy must be really salty. He's awful cynical about this whole thing. But over time, I've come to realize that he was pretty much right on the money. If you have a lot of talent, a lot of self-respect, the end game is not going to be comic book. You might have a stint in comic books. You might come over and dip your toe. Hell, maybe you do a decade or whatever, but eventually you're going to have to move on to some place that actually appreciates you. And in business, if someone appreciates you, they appreciate you with money. They appreciate you with benefits. Two things which you'll never really get a whole lot out of from DC or Marvel. And if you do get a lot of it, it'll only be very temporary because eventually your star will fade and then you'll get treated like all the other schlubs. And, you know, it's a terrible thing. Is the comic book industry really like killing creators? I think in a lot of cases it might be. It's probably taken years off of people's lives at this point, and it is a very interesting thing to look into. If you want to be a comic book creator, you definitely need to read this article. You need to look into the industry itself and find out, is it really worth it? Because a lot of people are going to tell you that it probably isn't. If after all that, you're still interested in getting into comic books, I mentioned Tim Lim earlier in the video. He actually came onto the channel like 3 years ago. I think it was over 3 years ago. He actually came onto the channel and talked about what it's like to break into comic books, things you need to be thinking about, what you need to keep in mind if you're an artist or writer and all that kind of stuff. It's a great conversation and definitely something you should look into if you want to get paid making comic books. There's also a link in the video description.